Hello, and welcome to Saving People, Queering Things, the supernatural podcast where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the retro TV series Supernatural. I'm Abigail, my pronouns are they, them, and I will be your host today for this special bonus episode. Today, we are pulling up to a very special bonus episode on the power of fandom, and here to join me today is special guest Valerie Gritsch, who is a brilliant artist, disability activist, and a fandom scholar. Valerie, can you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work and your experience with the supernatural fandom in particular.
Sure. My name is Valerie Gritsch, as Abigail said. My pronouns are she, her. And I have been born into fandom, essentially. I'm named after a song from a pop band that my parents loved. So I didn't really have a choice in the matter. I feel like I was always meant to be in this very fandom intense kind of way of being. Fandom has shaped my entire life. I've kind of just jumped from thing to thing that I was obsessed with, that were defining moments of my life. And my fandom led me to working with a lot of my favorite bands, which was very fortunate. And then I was like, I'm not done. There's more to fandom that's really interesting. And when I was studying media during my undergrad times, I discovered that fan studies was a thing, threw myself into that in a master's program that I recently completed. So my master's thesis was looking at how fans of David Bowie were transforming his hometown of South London in Brixton, and sort of using his fans as a case study to see like what are the rituals when we're mourning a celebrity and things like that. Because obviously we have media celebrities, but you can apply that more broadly to any kind of very visible public figure. Look at the Queen, for instance, most recently in England. So very interesting to me. Interdisciplinary field, fan studies. And I think that is a lot of fun. You get to play in a lot of different areas when you're studying fandom. And with Supernatural, I started watching Supernatural probably in 2011 or 2010. I think my friend Kate Mix got me into it, and we curse them to this day for that. They are wonderful, but they've ruined my life. Um, Automatically was a diehard fan of Castiel
Mm-hmm.
and related a little too closely to Dean. And then I fell out of watching it for a little bit. And then the pandemic hit, and it was going to be the last season. So I caught up to watch for the last season, and then the pandemic hit. And I was like, well, now I'm stuck at home, and I'm going to let this consume me even more so. And as you mentioned, I'm an artist as well. So I was like, I'm just going to use all of this free time I have to draw a bunch of supernatural inspired things. And then somehow I've convinced a lot of people to enjoy those things, which is wonderful and very flattering, and bizarre. But it's great because the supernatural fandom is so intense, and that's a great thing and a bad thing. But like, it keeps you on your toes, and it's not boring at the very least.
Yes. Oh, goodness, never boring. Sometimes it could do with being just slightly more
I could
boring.
take a skosh of boring here and there.
Yeah.
Just give me a day. I was promised
Yeah,
peace
exactly.
when I was done.
I'm not, first off, I'm not done. And second off, there's been no peace.
No.
You would have started watching, I think, a similar time to when I started watching.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, roughly about 2011-ish.
You were suffering in tandem.
Yes, yes. And also, I also cursed the friend that got me into Supernatural a little bit. Like I got out for a while. I was out for
And then
like
they pull you back
4
in.
years, and then the pandemic and the final season happened, and I came screaming back in after 15-18, only to be royally fucked by the finale. And then here we are.
Now here we are, clowning around and watching the Winchesters and begging
Yes.
Vincent Ackles for scraps.
Yeah, okay, so at the time of recording this episode, the pilot of the Winchesters just came out like 5 days ago. So that's all we know about the Winchesters at the point. Just for a timestamp on this, I feel no, I feel feral about that.
But it's a comforting kind of feral.
Yes, I did, and I don't like crying at TV shows. Like, I'd like to be like I'm crying, but I usually am not. I'm usually processing and just like blank stare processing. I did tears were sprung to my eyes at when I heard Dean's voice after 2 years. I did. It was a
Oh
moment.
yeah.
I tried so hard to be chill in everything leading up to the Winchester. I tried so hard to be like, this is not the spin-off I wanted, so I'm going to watch it, but I am going to be very cautious. And then I heard Dean's voice, and I was like, well, that's out the window
Oh
now.
yeah. When I saw the pilot, I slapped the ever loving shit out of my friend. And like just slapped and grabbed them their arm or like part of their hand and just like death gripped it. Because I just didn't know what to do.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, so I thought a good place to start would just to be talking about like what fandom is, from the big perspective as well as our own personal experiences, because obviously like we've been brought together by Supernatural, but clearly it was not your first fandom, it's not my first fandom, and it's not my only fandom. And so yeah, I probably should have prepped a little bit more for this. I was just like, I'm gonna talk about it a little bit. But I also I wanted to just kind of start there. Do you have a way that you would define fandom?
Yes. And the way I define fandom, I define it in two different ways personally. And that's tied to defining the word fan. So most people, when they're defining fan, they're defining it as the people who are like us, the more intense people who follow the person, place, or thing that they are a fan of. They're not interested in the casual viewer typically. For me, in my daily life, when I'm not wearing my academic hat, I define fan as anyone who likes the thing, whether you're super intense about it or not. Um, I think it should be a very egalitarian approach where you don't need to own a certain amount of merch. You don't have to have, listened to every song or watched every episode. Um, if you're here and you're excited about the thing and you're not harming anyone with that excitement,
Mm-hmm.
you are a fan. Congratulations. Well, come on board. Do you know about this thing? You don't? Let me show you all the things. And now, like, let me share the like, insanity brewing in my brain. So I'm very much like that,
Yes.
like the opposite of gatekeep girl bossing when I can like find somebody who's just beginning the journey because I'm just so excited to share it with people.
Yes.
But I think it's just easier when you draw that boundary line in fandom and fanhood. So you can define a fandom as a subculture that's linked by people who have similar interests and typically the same ideologies. So because of that, a fandom is a community and we have our own rituals and practices and way of talking to one another and like, shorthand and inside jokes and in knowledge that, you and I could say a sentence that would mean absolutely nothing. It's going to sound like gibberish to anyone else, but you and I know it. So we can say, Abigail, why lamp? And if you've seen season 15 of Supernatural and you're into that meta knowledge, you're going to understand exactly what I'm talking about. If I go to my mom and I'm like, Linda, why lamp?
Yes.
She's going to be like, the fuck are you talking about? Because, she's not in on our language and our knowledge.
Yeah.
So I think when most people are studying fandom, they're talking about that it's these people who have this own way of speaking and interacting and it's just not that casual interest. It's not as egalitarian. But at the core of it, we're more interested at this participatory culture that's happening there. And that we are not only interacting with the object of our fandom, but with each other. And that we're doing so especially in transformative ways. So that's taking the canon text and we're remixing it and we're rewriting it and we're just fucking it up in so many ways, but not in a negative sort of fucking it up way. We're just sticking our hands in the paint and seeing what's happened. That's always a lot of fun and way more interesting than just accepting what you're being given, I think.
Absolutely. When I think about fandom, I think I also kind of do both of those things where I think of fandom as very much that subculture way, whereas like I think fan is something that if you say you are one, like and you care about the thing, then that is an accurate label. I think that's one of the like strengths of not every fandom space, but that is a strength of a fandom space, is its inclusivity if it's willing to be that. But again, like any subculture, that's like something you work for. And I liked what you said about like ideals being really and a big part of that cultural piece of fandom of each fandom has that those things it believes in or doesn't believe in, and those inform the way it builds its community. And I think about like different, even just different fandoms, like both from being a part of them and also from observing fandom on the internet largely, there is differences in terms of like the ideology and what that means for why certain fandoms have stronger senses of community than other certain, why certain pieces of media garner fandoms that become really strong communities, and some pieces of media garner a lot of fans but not the same level of community. And that's
Absolutely. And it makes me think of, because my roots are very much in the music fandom world. And as we talk, my music fandom is going to involve a lot of what I'm talking about. But the beautiful thing is that all of these ways of thinking and talking about a fandom, it doesn't matter what you're applying it to. It's one size fits all kind of. But you mentioned one might garner more interactions and stuff like that than another, and my head instantly went to like the Grateful Dead fans and Fish fans and Frank Turner fans, like the people who are going to go to multiple dates of a tour and they're going to camp out all day to make sure they're first in line, and there's this like big like community that surrounds it, and it becomes more about interacting with those other fans than it is just seeing the concert. Like the concert's just a happy thing that's also occurring in this space, and it's like the catalyst for bringing these things together. But the focus is way more on the people interacting within themselves. And you don't see that, like when Paul McCartney tours, you don't get that same cultish makes it sound bad, but we lack other terminology.
The cult following sort of terminology.
We see this a lot with religious terminology too. Like you just lack the language essentially to talk about it. But like this really devoted following, you don't see that with Paul McCartney. You kind of see it with Bruce Springsteen. You don't really see it with the Rolling Stones. And it's interesting that to see who inspires it and who doesn't. And they could be very similar artists, it could be very similar media properties, but why does one inspire these things and one doesn't? And that comes down a lot to the fandom and the ideologies that they're sharing within it,
which I think is really interesting. Like even when you think about something like Supernatural, which has this huge, very, very participatory, very active, one of the most active like fandoms in terms of like television fandom, but it's not like you could go up to anyone on the street and be like, have you seen Supernatural? And a good chunk of them will have heard of it. A lot of them maybe will have seen a little bit, but it's not the same, it's not like some other movies that maybe everyone will have seen. And the fandom is different as well than some of those other things that are bigger. And when you were describing the music piece of it, that's what I was thinking about, is like some of those artists that have that strongest like community feel are not the ones that are like selling out the massive stadiums on their tours.
Absolutely.
There's something else about those fandoms that's bringing together that like community piece. It's quite remarkable. And it is always interesting to see what I feel like I've experienced this even with just like growing up on Tumblr. You get a new show and I would have such a warped idea of like what shows were popular generally, because I would be on Tumblr and I would see 50 million GIF sets for something, I'm trying to think of a good example. I'd see, okay, so
Sherlock.
Yeah. And then I'd go into the real world, and Sherlock's like kind of a good example, but like not as much. But like I'd go into the real world and everyone would be talking about Sherlock for like a day. And on Tumblr it'd be like weeks and we'd still be talking about the same 3 GIF sets. Or you'd get something even smaller, you'd get like Hannibal, which like was big, but was massive on Tumblr and massive in fan spaces and its own community, but didn't have the same like range across TV watchers who aren't intense fans of something.
Right. They might have watched the show weekly on NBC, but if you show them, Winston in a flower crown, they're not going to understand it.
Yeah. Which comes back to that language piece too, of like, I had like, I was explaining the Winchesters to my partner who like has only watched a little bit of Supernatural. We're slowly working our way through it. And I was explaining the divorce, and what, like I had explained it and then I used the term divorce and I was like, And then I had to stop and be like, I have to explain. This is not language that makes any sense to you if you, and even the context of like why I thought it was important. Like I was
Mhm.
like, to watch the Winchesters, you need to understand some of the context of this show coming to be and why, you need to understand some things about the finale, you need to understand some things about the fandom. And he, his response to me like explaining the divorce was to be like, is that really important? And I was like, it is.
It is.
It is. I was like, I don't know how to explain to you why it is, but like, I'll try. But it is because again, but I'm steeped in this particular fandom's like culture and lingo, and that's why it feels natural to me to know why things are important. And
Absolutely.
obviously, like fandom has been around as long as people have been making things, to various extents. But modern fandom culture is, I think, more of what a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to like music and TV shows and artists and things like that. Obviously, like one of the biggest like fandom pieces, especially in terms of television, is like Star Trek is a huge birther of like modern TV culture fandom, and a lot of the
Mhm.
like kinds of transformative works that we see now in fandom did kind of come into being with Star Trek. Fan fiction writers and fanzines and even fan conventions are all kind of or originate there. I'm curious about like because your experiences in music fandom. Do you have thoughts on I guess how modern fandom is sort of how it has developed from then to now?
Yeah, interesting because you can very easily, as you said, point to Star Trek, sort of as what we consider modern fandom. And certainly somebody like Henry Jenkins, who's very much considered sort of the father of fan studies, he came out with a work called Textual Poachers in the early 90s that looked at things like Star Trek and the transformative work that people were doing around it specifically. But the Star Trek phenomenon very much came out of that kind of post World War II explosion with accessibility. So you had people who were fans of things before then,
Of
but the
course.
television being in people's homes made it so much more accessible that they could find their media property of choice and let it consume them in whichever way they saw fit. And the practices that they were doing around Star Trek are very similar, if not the same ones that we are doing today in
Mm-hmm.
various forms. They're shipping characters, they're creating their own head canons, they're writing their own fics. We can thank Star Trek fans for the Omegaverse.
Yeah.
Like
my favorite fun fact about the Omegaverse is that
yeah, it's like William Shatner, you're the original Omega. Congratulations.
oh, and he would hate it, and I love that.
Shatner's gonna track me down now and kill me. But even Star Trek came out in what, 65,
Six,
66?
yes, yeah.
The first sci-fi convention happened in 1939. That's 30 years beforehand.
Mhm.
And then if you go back even earlier, the word fandom was not the first usage of fandom, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, tracked and traced down to 1903. So that's 1903. You
Okay.
get the first usage of the word fandom. And now I'm going to be a little bit of a word nerd for you.
Yes, please.
Because I love trolling like the history of words and stuff like that on the dictionary. Merriam-Webster defines the word fan as an enthusiastic devotee, a spectator, and an ardent admirer. And it's believed
Ooh.
correctly that the word fan comes from the word fanatic, and the word fanatic comes from the Latin word of fanum. Fanum means sanctuary or temple, and this is really interesting
Ooh.
because so often we describe how we're feeling and what practices and rituals we're doing within our fandom with religious terminology.
Yes.
So this is a really cool kind of parallel that like we're trying to almost replace religion in our lives with these pop culture things and fandom, but we're still using religious terminology to do so. And just the way we're identifying ourselves is tied to, I am a fan of Supernatural. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, I am a temple of Supernatural. How cool is that? Like,
Yeah.
that's such an interesting way of like framing things.
Yeah.
But I digress a little bit. That was 1903. We have that usage of the word fandom. And then you go back into the 19th century, fandom existed there. You just have to look at poor old Arthur Conan Doyle. And as we spoke of Sherlock,
Yep.
all the dude wanted to do was get on with his life and find some other hobbies, and he kills off Sherlock Holmes in the Reichenbach Fall, and the people lose their ever loving shit, and they're holding memorial vigils, which is very relevant to my interests, and they're mourning a fictional character, and they're
Yep.
writing fix and ways for him to come back from the dead. And it's like, holy shit, like they literally annoyed Arthur Conan Doyle into bringing him back to life. How cool is that? Like, how so similar to like a show gets canceled, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine gets
Yeah.
canceled. There's an uproar. Suddenly it's picked up and
Mm-hmm.
it's saved. Like, this is the same shit, different century.
Exactly. You think of like something like Community, which like just got announced it's getting a movie, and it, was a show that struggled with cancellation constantly, but has this incredible like fandom that is so loyal, that has just been never given up.
It's wild when you think about this, because nothing that we're doing is original.
No.
Nothing that we're doing is new.
No.
It's all been done before, and that I think is really sort of comforting. And you can go back even earlier, to the early 19th century, where you have Lindo and Listomania. And those are the fan responses to the opera singer Jenny Lind and the composer Franz Liszt, respectively. And that's from like the 1840s to the 50s. And so people would buy tickets to see their live performances of the opera or whatever they were composing, because that's when these live performances were becoming more affordable to the lay person. Beforehand, you had to have the money to get an instrument if you wanted to learn how to or hear music. You had to know somebody that played music. You had to have the money to get an instrument and somebody to teach you how to use that instrument. Or if you were rich enough, you could hire someone to play it for you. Or maybe a family friend, whatever, had somehow got their hands on a guitar or something similar, and they could play something for you that way. But suddenly, because concert halls are being built and tickets are being sold and they're kind of affordable, the every person could get access to that. And even if they couldn't, there are diary and journal entries that you can look up where someone was so desperate to hear live music, they would crash church services to hear hymns being performed. Like, that's so cool. Like, it's nothing is new.
No.
Even more broadly speaking, anything can be a fandom. Like, religions are fandom. Who's the most mourned celebrity, Abigail?
Yeah.
I will tell you. His name is Jesus.
Yep.
Political parties are fandoms. Nationalism is a form of fandom.
Sports is maybe the most common
Absolutely.
and understood fandom, like socially acceptable fandom.
Absolutely.
To be, a little bit batshit about.
It's so interesting because I am a batshit sports person, on top of batshit everything else. So it's very interesting the differences that I see in myself with switching between my fandoms, where it's like, I'm going to see my favorite band, but I can't wear the shirt of the band I'm going to see. Meanwhile, I'm going to a Mets game. I need my Mets t-shirt, my Mets earrings, the hat, the scarf, the jacket, their shoes with their logo on that I'm thinking of getting, like every possible accessory with their logo on it, and I have to wear all of it at once to the game. Meanwhile, how dare I even think about wearing the hoodie of the band to the concert? Like, it's
there's like different
things like that,
like not even rules, but just sort of community acceptable practices, which is again similar to like the religious nature of fandom, where we have these rituals, we have these anniversaries, we have these like sort of holy days. Like I think of in the Supernatural fandom, I can think off the top of my head of several days that have become, even in the past 2 years, like these sort of like sacred events where we come together as a community to mourn, to celebrate, to rewrite stories, because that's how we remember, that's how we care for each other, that's how we acknowledge what we've experienced. Like that's all religious. Like that's all.
Absolutely. Like, January 24th and September 18th, Dean and Castiel's birthdays. Well, Castiel's first appearance in Lazarus Rising. Or November 5th very obviously is a day of celebration and remorse. they very much are high holy days, which I think is so cool.
It's so cool. And like this is something that I think is so interesting, that especially with the advent of, like, especially with the internet, like you said, these fandom things have been happening like they've been happening. They are just entrenched in just, I think, our experience of like being humans. But the internet has brought another level of that accessibility piece to make fandom wider and larger. You know, we now can do these rituals from our own homes, like from our own screens, from our own phones. You know, our communities are not just the people we're gathering with in physical spaces, but they're also the people we're gathering with in online spaces. Yeah, like fandom morphs and changes to fit those new spaces, but we still do all of the same things. We're just not.
Absolutely. And I mean, I even looked at this with my thesis work because the day that we found out that David Bowie died, there was a mass spontaneous gathering in his hometown of Brixton. There were thousands of people gathered and just singing songs and kind of just paying their respects and celebrating his life. I have a very vivid memory of sitting in my bedroom where I'm speaking to you from right now and watching live streams on Twitter of the celebrations and whatnot for hours. I was watching, jumping from different live stream to different live stream and, saying, oh, okay, the people who are standing in front of this shop are singing this song. But then, maybe 100 yards away, there's another group of people and they're performing this song in tribute to him and stuff like that. And, oh, here's like a big mural that people are leaving flowers and cards and candles and stuff in front of. And that's really interesting. Let's watch a live feed of people putting shit on the floor in front of this picture. And then it's an interesting way that you can, as I say, travel without moving when you're interacting online and through that kind of live space, and not just after the fact, especially that you can experience things and be a part of that knowledge, and you're participating in real time even by not being there.
Yeah.
And then if somebody makes reference to that thing in particular, you can be like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about, but I wasn't there.
I was there, but I wasn't physically
Right.
there, but I was there.
I was, 3,000 miles away across the ocean, but like I have a pretty good understanding of what the vibe was that night because I spent hours there essentially. It's really no different when you look at, supernatural fan conventions and the way that people will covertly live stream the panels in real time, and you can sit there and listen to things as it's being discussed as if you're in the room. So okay, I can't go to the convention in Kansas City, but oh my God, there's going to be a radio company appearance, and there's someone covertly streaming the audio, and I get to hear Jensen Ackles singing, Led Zeppelin in real time or whatever, and I'm losing my shit just like everybody else who's in the room.
Yeah.
So it's a really cool way that we're still finding ways to kind of connect with one another as things get more and more accessible as well.
Which is very exciting because I think both of our experiences are so much like fandom has been so much a space of like belonging, which is going to lead me into my next question in a second. But like that accessibility piece means that we have those opportunities, and that's even changed in even our lifetimes. Like my experience of fandom when I was younger and my experience of fandom now has already shifted in some really cool ways. But that kind of leads into my next question, which was around like what are some of your own personal earliest experiences with fandom, and yeah, what were those like, and why is fandom like personally important to you?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, I'm named after a song. I'm named after the Monkees song Valerie. I very nearly was named after the Beatles song Prudence, and I'm very glad I wasn't.
You got the
Because
better end of the deal there.
yeah, the nickname of Prude, I don't think I would have liked having very much, but Val I can fuck with.
Yeah.
So I joke that I didn't really have a chance because like I came out of the womb with a fandom name, and my parents met because of they were both in their college's Beatles club, so my parents met because of fandom.
Oh, cool.
And when I was very young, I was obsessed with the Beatles, and I used to watch their cartoons and their films and listen to their music all the time and stuff like that. So that was the first thing I really remember like being kind of obsessed with. We're talking probably 4 years old, like very young. And then when I got a little bit older in like the mid 90s, I discovered the Spice Girls and the Backstreet Boys. And I was like, ha, yes, this is everything now. And that's really what started the sort of fanish behavior that you associate with being a fan. Whereas obviously before I was too little to like understand stuff, I was just like obsessively listening and watching things. And then I got a little bit older and like I found out about capitalism, and it's like, well, I need every Spice Girls lollipop, and I need the Spice Girl dolls, and I need every magazine that has the Backstreet Boys on the cover. And
Yep.
I'm gonna watch TRL and feel like a big kid, and the people are screaming when the Backstreet Boys come on there, so I probably should be screaming when I hear the Backstreet Boys too.
Picking
And
up
just like
those cultural things.
right, and just like learning through observation of like what people are doing, and like they're
Hmm.
reacting this way about this stuff, I should do that too, to show that I am in this like group,
Yeah.
and that I belong to them. And like just that behavior of collecting as much as I could, and like sitting there with a tape recorder and a cassette tape, and
Oh,
recording them off the radio, or on off the TV on a VHS tape, and like clipping out those magazine pictures and interviews and putting them into scrapbook. And in hindsight, I think that kind of shaped me in a major way, because I realized I didn't necessarily need to be connected to that larger community to still be a fan.
hmm.
Like I could just sit in my own little corner and be like, I'm gonna do me, you guys can do
I can
you.
enjoy this thing and
Yeah,
it's independently of anyone else, and
exactly.
that's enough. That's enough.
Right. And like it's gonna fulfill me, it's gonna make me happy. And I don't need to be intensely involved with the other people, but I'm still very much a part of this community. And I know the language. So if I want to participate, I can, but I'm not going to sort of force it. And I think that really feeds into the way that I feel now, where it's like, well, if you say you're a fan, then you're a fan. Because you don't need to engage with all of the discourse and the language, and you don't have to go to the conventions and do these things. And I think it's interesting as well that I kind of came to this decision, through my introduction to being like having a commercialized fandom, of being like, I'm old enough now, I see there's merchandise available. I want the Backstreet Boys t-shirt, I want this, I want
Yeah.
that. And like hoarding my little collection, like I have all my Backstreet Boy toys from my Happy Meal at Burger King. um but like just understanding that the flip side is also true, that just because you don't have those things or don't do those things, that doesn't like make you any less of a person
Yeah.
within that field.
Yeah. And I think that's like such a important thing to like, remember, and especially I think especially when you become a fan who's maybe been a fan for a long time, or you feel like your fandom experience is very intense, or you are, to like be the greatest thing about fandom is when it has really wide open arms to be like every kind of fan is important,
Mhm.
both like those who create fan works, those who don't create fan works, like you belong here because you belong here, and like it's one of those cultural groups that anyone can be a part of just by nature of wanting to be a part of it. And I think that has some power, and it's easy to, yeah, gatekeeping really sucks. and
It
it
does.
and it like ruins people's experience of fandom, and it's totally unnecessary because like you said, like every fan has their own unique way of being a fan. And I think that's a really nice thing to be able to honor. Like, I think sometimes I even have to remind myself of that. Even now, like, I mean, now I do a lot of fandom creation stuff that I never used to do when I was younger. And so sometimes now, if I get really, busy, or I miss something big in one of the fandoms that I'm in, I can feel like really like, oh, like how bad of a fan was I? Like, I missed that whole drama. Like, I didn't wait. And I have to remind myself sometimes, I'm like, that does not, I was like, this thing exists, and this fandom exists to be something joyful that I'm experiencing, and something where I am, hopefully becoming a better person and a better member of my communities. And that's it. There's no other rules other than that. Like, I have my personal code of like, this is what the kind of person I want to be in fandom. And beyond that, I'm like, have a good time, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Engage with what you want to engage with. Don't engage with what you don't want to engage with. And
Absolutely.
if you can do that ethically, then that's enough. And I'm really grateful for, having some of those different experiences even as a younger child. Like my first experience with fandom, maybe not my first experience, my really vivid ones I remember from like my very young childhood was like my mom read me the Chronicles of Narnia when I was like 4, and I was obsessed with that series. Like I owned every possible like book that would talk about Narnia. I had like just I my earliest writing is like was like poems inspired by it that I didn't realize at all was like fan fiction until like
Mhm.
probably 10 years later, and early 2000s like internet forums were my first foray into like an online spaces for fandom. But like you, it was like a lot of my initial fandom was just me on my own and me trying to talk to anyone who would hear me talk about them. You know,
Oh yeah.
anyone who would listen, but I would be like, can I tell you 29 facts about, this character? Can I talk you through their entire timeline from the date of birth to the end of their story? Like,
Yeah, we're evangelicals on the street with pamphlets saying, have you heard about our Lord and Savior Frank Turner? Um, can I interest you in this?
yes.
And and again, the religious metaphor, but
Oh, yeah.
like it's very much the same in my personal experiences with anything, like with music, with my Lord of the Rings fandom that to this day consumes me with an iron grip. My Mets baseball fandom. My dad sure made a fool of himself there, being like, I'm gonna get my daughter into baseball. Well, now I'm a bigger fan than him, and he's gotta be like, maybe we need to not do all the things. And I'm like, but why?
But you're like, but
Um,
this is part of who I am. Like, this is part of
right.
the collage of things that make me me.
You did this. I learned from watching you,
Yes.
and then I got worse. Um,
Oh, I love doing that. I love taking something that someone has introduced me to and then becoming more feral about it
yeah,
accidentally, and then being like, I'm sorry, this is kind of your fault.
yeah.
Like,
Also, I'm a huge history nerd. History nerd is just another way of saying history fan, and it's
yeah.
like the history fandom itself is a wild time. But even my enjoyment of history and learning things and sharing, fun historical facts, I am insufferable. I am insufferable. And the love of that is my parents' fault, and it was put into effect through a musical from Broadway because I was a little kid and they showed me this musical 1776. And we watched it every year. It's about the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence. We watched it every year on the 4th of July. And then, oh no, she grew up to be a huge psychotic history person. Who could have seen this
What a
coming?
surprise.
Yeah, like I recently saw it. There's a revival on Broadway right now, and I recently saw it. And I was talking about something in the intermission, and a guy next to me in the aisle, and in the row was like, "Oh, are you a historian?" I'm like, "No." I mean, yes, technically, but
Yes.
like not like that's not my profession. I just saw this at an early age, decided to make it my entire personality and everyone else's problem. And that's kind of how I approach fandom as a general.
Yes.
Like it's my entire personality and everyone else's problem.
Yeah, and I think I relate to that a lot because that is also my experience. Is like I'm like I have never known how to like something halfway. Like
Mhm,
I have two modes. I have I don't care, and I have this is my whole personality.
mhm,
And I feel that way. I feel that way about hockey because I grew up watching hockey with my grandmother, and I feel that way about the books that I read as a child. And I have some interesting experiences because I was actually raised evangelical. So I have like it's very interesting to me now looking at fandom and comparing it to some of my experiences in even kind of cult like sort of evangelicalism and some of the darker sides of that,
mhm,
and but to see also some of that same level of devotion and to
mhm,
go, okay, like what is it about these things that we've devoted ourselves to, and then how do we take those things and have them actually make us better people? How do we like the things that we are fans of, how do we do that in a way that allows us to be like enthusiastically devoted to something, in a way that like benefits those around us, and instead of being exclusionary actually is like inclusionary.
mhm.
um and that, yeah, that was the point I was making.
I don't know if we'll ever even get there, which is the saddest thing about it.
Yeah.
Like it's wonderful to want things to be inclusionary.
Hmm.
Um, but there's so many fandoms that like that is just not the core
Yep.
goal. And
No.
I think we're really lucky, especially in my experience with the supernatural fandom,
Hmm.
for all of the infighting between like ship factions and even people within the same ship having a disagreement or battle lines being drawn over whatnot. I'm thinking specifically of Destiel being a queer bait. Which side of the debate do you
Yeah.
fall on,
Yeah.
etc. Um, and It's wild because even with all of that, I think the supernatural fandom as a whole is very much that what you described of being a fandom that wants to find the sort of greater good and do good and help people. And I think a lot of that comes back to the story of that's being told in Supernatural, to begin with. And, especially when you think of politics as fandom, that's when you get into things, it's like, oh, well, you're not concerned about the greater good at all, but your whole fucking heart is in on this. And that gives me a lot of concerns about you and the community that you think that we should all be living in and stuff like that. And there's these greater implications. And it's interesting when you look at things like politics kind of through this fandom lens, because it just gives you, I think, a deeper understanding of the fans, the voters, and the celebrity who's the politician and stuff like that.
Yeah, and the power of those things, like recognizing fandom is not inherently fandom is inherently has this power, and it can go either direction. You can use that power in a way that is good, or a way that is just really, really not.
Yes, I agree. I'm sorry if you can hear Dave in the background.
I can't hear him, but I saw your reaction. I was like, I bet that's Dave.
Yeah. He's decided to start mooing at me.
Yeah, we've kind of already started to talk about some of these things, and I want to leave room for anything that you've had in your kind of notes and thoughts as well. But so your thesis and a lot of your work has been around like fandom and grieving and celebrity, and I would love to hear a little bit more about that and like what were some of the big things that you found.
So the biggest thing to me that interests me with what I did my master's thesis on is pilgrimage, and just that act of traveling to some place that's related to the object of your fandom. And I did that the night that Bowie died virtually. I traveled without moving, and I was there. 6 months later, I was in London visiting friends of mine, and I ended up getting to visit his hometown that I had seen on the live stream the night he died. So that was really interesting. But even before that, I was just always obsessed with the act of just going places related to the things I like. Like I went to London with a friend of mine, and we did a special one-day trip out to Cardiff, and we saw a bunch of Doctor Who filming locations. And then, I live in New York City, and John Lennon lived here and died here. And for a number of years, even when I was in high school, I used to go and spend his death anniversary at Strawberry Fields in Central Park, where fans would gather every year since his death and sing Beatles songs and John Lennon songs and stuff like that. So that community sort of process of you're going to a place that's related to your sacred object, going to places related to the object of your fandom, and seeing how not only you interact with that place, but the other people who were there, has always really interested me. And like I said, it's something I was doing without even really realizing it. And it was something I was seeking out without realizing it before I ever started studying fandom.
That's so cool.
Again, like you see this in religion, like people making
the promise of pilgrimage is a religious concept,
right? Like going to Mecca, or going to Jerusalem, or any other place that is related to a moment in your holy text or whatever. It's like, okay, I really like the show Torchwood. I'm going to go find where the Torchwood hub was in Cardiff Bay and be like, in this spot is where Captain Jack Harkness did this. And, I look forward to the day that I can finally visit Vancouver, and then be like, and this is the spot where the bunker from Supernatural was. And then, get in a taxi, go across town and be like, and this is the spot that was the police department in Psych.
Yes. Oh, believe me, you come to Vancouver and you will just be doing that your whole life.
I am so excited for that.
I'm constantly like going places and being like, why do I vaguely recognize this location? And then being like, which show was it in?
Right.
And like when you're talking about pilgrimage, like when I was in high school, like in my like later years of high school, and I had just started watching Supernatural and become really obsessed. Me and my best friend at the time would go to Vancouver. Like neither of us lived in Vancouver. We both lived about 30 minutes outside of Vancouver, and we would like train into Vancouver, and we would go and try and find Supernatural like places where stuff had been filmed, largely churches as well, which is a whole nother level. Like we were both, you know, evangelical kids who were like, you know, Supernatural was a little bit taboo, and like we were engaging with this fandom that for both of us was making us feel seen in ways
Mm-hmm.
that we had never really been seen before. For myself, there was also all this like queer exploration that I was doing, and Supernatural was had become a very big catalyst for. And we would go and like sit outside, like sit on the steps of like churches that had been in Supernatural episodes, and it had this like very sacred sort of feeling to it. You know, it
Right.
felt like very, you know, and it was important to that friendship. It was important to us personally, and it was something about being in those physical spaces.
Right. You get to inhabit the space that what you like has inhabited. And in
Mm-hmm.
doing that, you're reclaiming the narrative and making it your own narrative. You're weaving it into your own personal story in a more tangible way,
Mm-hmm.
than just sitting at home and watching it on your television. Because you're physically in that space and interacting with that space. And that's really interesting. And I think that's something that I really enjoyed looking at when I was studying Bowie, is that I was looking at Brixton, which is the town where he was born. And his family moved out of there before he was very old at all. I think he was maybe elementary school age when they moved out of that town. But it's still seen as like the Bowie destination. And then you see it and you see the way people interact with it, and they're going to the place where he was born and the front garden, because he was born in just a random house where they lived. People are going on the front garden and they're picking the flowers out of their flower boxes. They're pulling the leaves off the trees. And that's no different than John Adams and Thomas Jefferson going to the house where William Shakespeare was born in Stratford upon Avon. And as early founding fathers, right after the founding of America, they took this trip and they chiseled off pieces of the furniture to bring back to America and keep. And you can see on display in Thomas Jefferson's home to this day a piece of wood from a chair in William Shakespeare's home. Um, so like that is the same behavior
Oh yeah.
that, you know, our founding fathers here in America, defacing property and stealing things, vandalism in the name of their fandom. They thought William Shakespeare was so cool, they're going to steal a piece of his home and like weave their identity in that small way with the thing they like. And the same thing is, well, my hero, David Bowie, was born here. And how do I connect with this? And how do I, take something back with me? How do I leave something of myself here?
Mm-hmm.
And you see that especially with leaving yourself there with you know people like to graffiti on walls and anything they can get their hands on, Valerie Gritsch, the date, I'm from New
Yep.
York City, scribbling on walls. And I mentioned that there's a mural that I was focused on the night that Bowie died,
Oh
and
yeah, I've
that
seen the
was,
picture of that
yeah,
mural.
that was a big focus of my study. This gorgeous mural done by Jimmy C. And people started writing, Abigail was here. We visited on this day, and then writing a little eulogy or a letter directly to Bowie himself and saying like, "You're always my starman." Like Major Tom went home, things like that. It's just, you're leaving yourself in that spot that was his.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a very cool thing that we have done throughout the ages of just this is something that's important to me, and I need to take a piece of it and I need to leave a piece of me and
Mm-hmm.
have that like transactional experience.
Yeah. And I think of that even in like digital spaces, because that also happens. And like I remember when Leonard Nimoy died.
Hmm.
And that was like one for me that was really significant. Star Trek is like one of the fandoms that has had the most impact on me personally. And I remember, yeah, similarly doing like scrolling through just tribute after tribute, like getting as immersed in that day, in that moment as I could. And on my personal Instagram, I can go back to that day and see a post that I made in memorial, like that. You go to the tag on that post and you can scroll through any number of people who were doing the same thing in a digital space. trying to leave their connection, their mark in that moment, in that place, so that we can mourn together. And that is really cool.
And like it's forcing us as fans to become part of the narrative. And that I really like as well. I like the the reclaiming of the story. And in doing that, we're dictating what the legacy of that person, place, or thing is going to be. So you look at David Bowie, and if you read those messages that are graffitied onto the wall of a department store in Brixton, you are going to see declarations of love. You're going to see people saying that he was like their queer awakening. He made it feel okay to be weird and different. And he was an alien, and he was otherworldly and gorgeous and sexy and all of these positive things. You're not going to see people talking about his time as the persona, the thin white duke, which was like fueled on cocaine and saying pro-fascist things. You know, we're brushing those negative things. You're not going to see people writing messages about the underage groupies that he slept with and took advantage of. You're going to only see the positive, and that's shaping that narrative of Bowie was wonderful and he was this for these many people. And like that's true, but you need to be able to hold that negative part of their personality, because they're whole flawed people, in your same hand, and be like, okay, like these two things can coexist. And you know, I can think Supernatural is a wonderful show, and you know, I'm going to rewrite my legacy. And what am I going to focus on? I'm going to focus on Dean and Cass, and you know, the connection they share and how it's so wonderful, and it can be shaped and transcended into so many different things and in so many different ways. But I can also acknowledge that it was a queer bait, and it was bury your gays, and it was harmful for XYZ, and that they, you know, glorified suicide with their finale and stuff like that. And both things can be true. We just have to be careful that in, you know, the parts that we're celebrating, we're not forgetting the negatives.
Yes, which is kind of like one of the things I wanted to get into, was like the, you know, the risks and challenges in fandom. Like you said earlier, like inclusivity is a great goal, but it's not 100% always like possible, slash, you know, will we ever get there? Like probably not. And that also, you know, the tension of holding humanity and the messiness of that and mistakes, and the different experiences. Like Supernatural fandom particularly, I mean, all fandoms I think have this, but the Supernatural fandom has a really complex relationship with its creators, with its actors, and with, you know, its progression into, you know, the positives, even the changes that have happened very recently, and then its history, which does have a lot of really harmful things that have happened, both in the show and outside of the show in the fandom. And like holding those things is really a really challenging thing to do. And I'm wondering, like, from your experience slash your understanding of fandom, how do we navigate that tension, to be you know, to be better fans, and to make that a safer space for the most people that we can.
Right. And it's really difficult as well, because especially when you go back and you look historically speaking about fandoms of any kind, but especially from like the 19th century on, who were the people that were writing about these fandoms? And they're predominantly cis heterosexual white men. They are the keepers of history up until very recently. They're the journalists, they're the historians. And you know, fandom in the cases of listomania and Beatlemania, those are like, mania is a disease, it is a mental illness. And you know, you tie mania with hysteria, which is coded very explicitly as a female disease. And you know, in extreme cases, you would get a hysterectomy in a case to cure your hysteria. God forbid non-cis men and women are excitable and emotional and anxious and having an increased sexual desire, potentially out in public spheres, where anyone who is, you know, the white men in power would have to tolerate them. And I think that, especially today, in places like the Supernatural fandom, we're not sort of beholden necessarily, because the people in power within the fandom are not those people. They are not the white cis heterosexual white men. That there's very little cis heterosexual white men in the Supernatural fandom.
I'm trying to think if I know any, and I'm like, oh, I can think of one or two. that I can think of.
Maybe.
Maybe. And I'm not even
Like,
100% sure about that, actually.
yeah, like we're very beholden to it when we broaden things out and we think about who is in the show, who is
Mm-hmm.
creating the show.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Supernatural, it very much has a problem with people of color, very much
Mm-hmm.
has a problem with queer characters, very much has a problem with disabled characters. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like there are issues there when you're talking about the canon, but in the fandom itself, you don't see that. But that doesn't mean that we are, you know, flawless. And that's something I would say is just a major takeaway that people should keep in mind, is that you shouldn't be afraid to kind of challenge the fandom hegemony. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a very snobby academic way of saying don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
And that the any social or ideological influences that are being forced on you by whoever that dominant group is. So, you know, we don't have this cis heterosexual white men in our fandom spaces, but who's the majority? Because whoever is the majority is the one that's creating that status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we are having the majority that is, it seems to be at least, not cis, not hetero, not men, potentially queer, you know, but predominantly it seems to be white women. And even then, you know, we're all operating under patriarchal and ableist white supremacy. And no matter how woke that we all think we might be, there's always going to be more work to be done.
Yeah.
So it might seem like it's a progressive space because there's no, you know, cis men in power, woo, cis white men in power. But like, there's not a lot of fans of color either around here.
No.
And you have to wonder, why is that? Are we creating a hostile environment for them, even if we may not be intending to?
Yeah.
You don't see a lot of people who are like out and loud and proud about being disabled in this fandom. Are you creating a hostile environment for them? As a very loud disabled Supernatural fan, the answer there is yes.
Yes.
Um,
I'm like, is absolutely, absolutely
yeah,
yes.
and like, you know, it's the work is just never going to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just going to have to make sure that we're listening to the voices of the various intersectionalities and identities that any one person could have. Otherwise, you're just going to fall back on whoever is loudest, which is going to be the white women who are may or may not be queer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not great because, you know, at the end of the day, white women are just as bad in most cases as white men. You know, you can't be afraid of challenging that. And if people make mistakes, you have to be willing to call them out and be like, oh, actually that person's pronouns are she they or they
Mm-hmm.
them, or, you know, this person identifies this way, or, you know, maybe that fic you're writing has some consent issues. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying ditch the whole fic, but I'm saying you better fucking tag that shit when you post it.
Yeah.
And like acknowledge that what you're writing or what you're drawing or creating and contributing to the fandom could potentially be harmful, and just not assuming that everyone is going to have the same life experience as you, because that's ridiculous. Especially if you're a white person, you're going to have a much different thing experience within the world and therefore in fandom, and something that may not be a trigger for you, you're not going to tag and you're not going to worry about.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, oh, you're going to write a fic where Dean is a cop? Okay. Oh, he shoots some and kills somebody on duty, and you're not thinking that you need to tag that as something that's like a potential trigger, especially in a post George Floyd world.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you need to confront that. We just have to keep having those kinds of conversations with each other and not be not jump to the automatic defensiveness that can come when people are trying to do the right thing in acknowledging these issues.
Yeah. And like the goal being, the concept of, safe spaces versus even like brave spaces, the concept of being able to be in a space and be like, our goal is not to make this like comfortable 100% of the time. Our goal is not to create this like hegemonic sort of situation where everyone feels like they can just exist and it's not ever going to be messy. Like the goal is actually for us to create spaces where when we fuck up, we have people who care about us and who care about our impact enough to tell us that, and we have the humility and like trust in them to know and to respond appropriately, like we have that, you know, and we're willing to have those like difficult conversations about, you know, is this accessible, is this causing harm, is this perpetuating, you know, something that is going to have an impact on people. And yeah, that willingness to not get too comfortable while also being able to relax and enjoy ourselves, because that's also like what I think a lot of us come into fandom, you know, come to fandom for a little bit of like a positive sort of escape from our own experiences sometimes in the world. And being able to hold both those things of like, I get to come to fandom, and yes, it gets to be an escape, and yes, I get to be in an alternate universe where everything is, you know, at the end, after the angst, there's going to be a happy ending. But we also have the responsibility to do that in a way that's good for other people and like
Yeah,
doesn't.
absolutely. And I think, you know, it's it's the way that I like to try and live my life just in general, but I think it's very important, especially in fandom spaces, which, you know, you're operating in much smaller communities. So you have really more of an impact on those around you, where it's just like, are you can enjoy this however way you want to enjoy it, but is it harming people? Is it
Mm-hmm.
hurting anyone? If you're not hurting anybody, and you're not negatively impacting anyone else, you're not impeding anyone else from their enjoyment by the way you're enjoying it, do whatever you want.
Yeah.
If what you're doing is potentially harmful and somebody reaches out to you and says it's potentially harmful, then you need to listen to that person, especially in such small communities and
Mm-hmm.
subcultures like this, if you want it to be better. Not least of all because it is incredibly scary to go and approach people and say, hey, this is hurting me,
Yeah.
because you're making yourself vulnerable. And
Mm-hmm.
usually you're saying that to somebody who has more power than you when these things happen. And from experience, I can say you're usually met with quite a lot of backlash and quite a lot of vitriol and how dare you and hate. And, you know, they curse you out and call you any number of names and will spend months at sometimes on a campaign to discredit you and everything you're saying. But it's still important to say the things.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, you know, I know that as a white woman myself, I can have certain privileges that other people are not going to. So I can speak up to other people and they may take what I'm saying more seriously. So I need to, for example, reach out to my community and say, I'm in this position of power. How can I leverage that? How can I help out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, you know, this person is listening to me apparently. So let me lift up my community with that if I can. And uh, try not to be too defensive myself and try to do the kind thing, because the kind thing is always better than the nice thing.
Yes, exactly. The word I was thinking about when you were saying that was like the, you know, having a community of like accountability and willingness for that, because that allows us to then recognize, you know, like position ourselves, recognize our own position and use
Mm,
it well, and yeah, use it kindly. I think that something that I've constantly recognized, you know, recognizing that piece and going, okay, what is my responsibility to my community in whatever role I find myself. And I think the really cool thing is when you see that playing out in that sort of mutuality.
mhm.
But we always have more to do to get there and to keep learning, you know.
Yeah, it's there's no one size fit all solution for any of the isms and discrimination that's out there.
Yeah.
Which is really a bummer. But I think, you know, as long as people have an open mind and, you know, they're willing to put in the work for the thing they care about and they're not afraid to critique the thing they care about, then I think things will eventually keep moving in the right direction. And like, yeah, there's going to be missteps and there's going to be mistakes made. And you may take, you know, one step back to go two steps forward. But, you know, I think it does just keep slowly going in the right direction at the very least. And, you know, to tie it back to Supernatural, you can see that at the minimum of what we're allowed to talk to the cast about at conventions, for example. Like
Oh.
Destiel was, you know, the black sheep. You couldn't even say anything about it without like getting eye rolls or belittled by cast members or having staff members, you know, just tell you you can't ask that question. And now 2 years out, we're able to sometimes have those
Yeah.
conversations and ask those questions. And is it perfect? No, but like we're still very slowly, but we still are moving kind of in the right direction of being able to talk about, queerness or any
Mhm.
other issue within the show. And that's important. And hopefully it will continue to happen.
Yes. Is there anything else from what you had been thinking about from your notes that you want to share or chat about?
I guess I would just reiterate to not be afraid of challenging that status quo. And to quote my friend Berkeley Novak Stoll's, cringe is dead.
Yes.
Um,
We have killed it.
yeah, cringe is dead. And, there's, I say this so often that the world is a big fat mess and it's a disaster and it's scary and it's upsetting. And if you can find one scrap of joy in this messy, fucked up world, grab onto it with two fucking hands and don't let anyone take it away. And like if you can find that, and like I said, you're not hurting anyone with what brings you that joy, then enjoy it. Don't worry what other people are going to think about you. Don't worry what implications are out there. If you're not harming anyone, then just rock and roll. That's your thing. That's fine. Don't be embarrassed about it. Own it.
Yeah, exactly. It's I have nothing else to add to that because that's something that I feel like I am, relearning in my late 20s after a few years of sort of not engaging in fandom as much because I thought I had outgrown it. And coming back to it has been one of the most joyful, healing things the last couple of years.
It's so good to hear that. And like when I first started trying to work in the music industry, for example, I was told by numerous people who were interns like I was, and even supervisors, that I had to tone down my fangirl tendencies if I wanted to be taken seriously. And I was like, no,
No.
like, there's no reason why I can't, intern in the office of whatever company and do my job for the day and then go stand online and queue for however many hours, be in the front, sing along and dance and do whatever I want to do at the concert, and then, go to bed, come back the next day and go back to the office. Like there's no reason I can't do
No.
one and the other at the same time.
Being a fan doesn't take away your ability to be a critical thinker and to
Right.
do good, professional work in those areas. Like it does,
Right.
you can be 100% both of those things.
And the thing that makes me like aggressively happy and very petty is that I got my job from being a fan. I was such a psychotic, large fan of Frank Turner who never shut up about how much I adored his music. I went to London for the first time by myself. I had never even been on a plane before. I saved for months, got on a plane by myself, crossed an ocean alone, somehow ended up in a bar where his manager was, forced him to take a business card of mine and said, one day you're going to give me a job. And then a year later, his manager was at a New York City show offering me a job. And it was because I was such a fan and I wouldn't shut up. And a lot of people started listening to his music because I was such a fan and I wouldn't shut up. And they were like, do you want to do social media stuff where you don't have to shut up? And I was like, yes, I do. So, all those people who told me I couldn't be a fangirl and be taken seriously, suck on that. Like
Yes,
I wasn't
exactly.
I wasn't hurting anyone. And like you said, just being excited by the thing doesn't mean I can't think critically about the thing.
Mhm.
So I think that's wonderful that your story right now of how you're kind of refining, is that a word?
Yeah.
That you're
Yeah.
that you're finding fandom again,
Yeah.
and acknowledging that like you didn't need to put that part of yourself away. And I think a lot of people over the pandemic have been on very similar journeys where it's like I put this part of myself like in a box
Yeah.
because I was afraid someone's not going to take me seriously,
Yes,
or
exactly.
I'm afraid that people are going to think it's childish or whatever. And it's like, how is this childish? Look at Star Wars. Everything that's coming out
Yes.
Star Wars is made by fans.
Yes.
That is all fanfic. All the modern Doctor Who,
All
all
fanfic.
fanfic. Created by fans. And, Peter Capaldi, biggest fanboy in the world, got to play the Doctor himself. Good for you, Peter Capaldi.
We're watching that with the Winchesters, like Drake Roger, who's playing John. Like
This is Jensen playing
yeah.
fanfic writer just like the rest of us, only he was given lots of money and he doesn't have an AO3 account that we know of.
Exactly.
Like, this is the same thing. So how come it's okay for them to do and feel this way and do the things, and it's not okay for you to do the things? That's absurd. Do the things, enjoy it.
Exactly. And that transformative, like being a part of transformative works, is such a amazing community to be a part of. Like to be a part of making like fan fiction and fan art, like those are some of the most deeply transformative works in my own life have been. Like I can still like there's some fanfic that comes to mind immediately when I go things that have like shaped who I am as a person. And the be a fan, like make the things that you want to make that you don't see in the fan community, and like that for someone else might be something that changes their life, and at very least it will change yours. Like,
you know, your only consolation might be that you just are a little bit happier in your daily life. Oh no, what a horrible thing. You get to enjoy that thing that you like. That's awful.
Well, if there's anything else that you want to say, well,
I don't know. I love fandom, as that wasn't clear. And I never read fanfic either until the pandemic and getting into Supernatural and Destiel fanfic. And it's just been really enjoyable to kind of be part of that transformative work thing that I had never really let be part of my fandom experience before. And I think it's really special, and it's just another fun way to engage with things, because I would still be doing it, you know, even if I wasn't sharing it online with other people. But to bond with people over the media text and then bond with people over these transformative works, it's just a silly good time. And like even when you're like ugly crying and like sniffling with snot and you're gross and you're thinking about the last few chapters of 91 Whiskey, for example, you know, that's a fun time.
Yes.
I think about that fic like every day.
Yeah. I go back and read certain chunks of that fic, including the ending, like fairly regularly. I'm like, I need a dose of 91 Whiskey. There's a few fics that I
just beautiful, incredible writing is done within this fandom. Beautiful artwork is done within this fandom,
including yours.
Thank you. And like the video edits people do that are on YouTube and TikTok and stuff like that, like there's just so many different ways to engage with the text and change the meaning of certain things or emphasize certain meanings. And I think that's really fucking cool. Just the sheer amount of work that's out there. Like Destiel has the most fics ever. Like that's not nothing. The sheer amount that we have for these things is incredible, and I think that needs to definitely be celebrated more broadly by other people who are going to appreciate just like that this is something cool that's happening.
Amen to that. Well, and this does not have to be the only conversation. We would love to have you back, and I would love to have you back to like on and talk about a regular episode sometime.
Oh yes, I always have lots of feelings.
Yes, we'll get you on for like a Destiel episode. I mean, we're in season 4 now, so like there's a lot of them now.
Oh, every episode's a Destiel.
Every episode. But thank you so much, Val, for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
This was wonderful. This was amazing. And yeah, if people who are listening want to find you, your academic work, or your art, where can they do that? And I will also link anything you say in the episode description.
The easiest option is probably going to my website, which is just my first and last name.com. So valeriegritsch.com. And I'm on Twitter at Valderie, which is VALDERIE. I'm on TikTok. My name is just Valerie Gritsch over there. My art, I post under the name Spotted Hound Design for my beautiful spotted hound, David. And yeah, that's where I am.
If you haven't seen Val's art before, like absolutely go and look at it. It's incredible. You have a sticker club. And
yes,
like
we have a fun kind of sticker of the month club called the Spotted Hound Art Club.
Favorite.
Yes, where chaos reigns supreme and I have zero control over whatever happens. I just at the end of each month I'm just like, okay, you want this sticker, here you go. And guard my loins and you know, hope for the best.
It's my favorite. I've been the last few months that I've been a part of that. It's my favorite. I get so excited about these stickers. But I think your work is a really cool transformative piece because you are like the imagery, like you're doing that, you're doing so much of what happens in like fan fiction, but you're doing it in these like visual pieces that's connecting these, you know, themes and transforming the characters and the impacts that they and representing the impacts those characters have had on the fandom. And I can't say enough about your work. Like I really, really, really love it. And
Oh, that's so cool. Thank you. I don't think about it that intensely at all, but that is basically what I'm doing. You just put it into words and my brain is blown a little bit. It's like, oh shit, yeah, okay, that is what I'm doing. Cool. It only took me over a year to figure that out. Thank you, Abigail.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Here you go. Well, that brings us to the very end of this episode. If you are not already, you can subscribe to Saving People Queering Things wherever you listen to podcasts. Yeah, and you know, we have our website and we have social media and we have Discord, and all of that is on our website, which is queeringthingspodcast.com. I'm not used to reading all of these myself. Usually they split up between like 3 people, so I'm like, all right. Thank you again, Val, so much for being here.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Abigail.
You're very, very welcome. Anytime. Thank you all for coming along for the ride, and we wish you a peaceful road until we meet again.